The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Welcome to another episode of Speaking with the Senator. I'm Senator Kevin Avard, representing District 12. And today we're going to be talking about energy. And today I invited Don Kreis from the Consumer Advocate. Welcome to the show.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Senator. Thank you for having me.
I'm honored that you're here. We've seen much of you up at the Capitol, and so I wanted to share your brilliance, and if you don't mind me saying so, with my viewers. When we talk about energy, but before I actually talk about energy, what is a consumer advocate? What is your role as a consumer advocate?
The Office of the Consumer Advocate has existed in one form or another since about 1976, and my job is to represent the interests of residential utility customers, primarily at the Public Utilities Commission, but also at other forums like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and our regional forums and the legislature, so that's why you see me over at the State House.
And prior to that, you were a journalist?
Way back, I started my career as a journalist. I did that for 10 years, and I actually found that the lawyers I was interviewing were not answering my questions to my satisfaction about the law. And so I decided to go to law school to satisfy my curiosity about the law.
Interesting.
And I've always been interested in public utilities and regulation, and so eventually I found my way to the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission, where I worked for 9 years, and I eventually became the general counsel of the PUC, and then I was briefly exiled to Vermont for a few years, where I worked as a law professor, and I worked at the Public Utility Commission in Vermont for a year. And then I had the honor of being nominated and confirmed as a consumer advocate about a little more than a year and a half ago.
You know, people talk about Public Utilities Commission. What is the Public Utilities Commission? They come in, they talk all the time to us up at the Capitol. We have a couple of study committees. The reason I'm asking is a lot of these terms we take for granted that the general public knows what their role is.
Well, the Public Utilities Commission is about 100 years old in one form or another, and it is a three-person commission that functions a lot like a court does, and their job is to make decisions about public utilities. And in New Hampshire, public utilities these days are essentially electric companies, natural gas companies, and water companies like Pennachuck Water Works that you have here in Nashua. And because there are three members of the commission, each of them has one vote, so they do occasionally disagree and have 2-to-1 votes. And they tend to act like a court, which means they have all sorts of rules about having so-called ex parte contact with them, so you have to be careful what you say to the commissioners when you pass them in the hall, that sort of thing.
Interesting. And so you know the ins and outs of all that. And I just general understanding of what's going on up there. They made me chair of energy, Senator Morris, and I'm honored. But when you're made chair of a particular, such as energy, you're walking into a conversation that's been happening for a long time. And starting cold, it's very difficult to get up to speed, especially with all the different viewpoints, all the different angles, the different interests that are involved with energy. You're with the consumer advocate, so you have a narrow scope of what you want to do. And one of the things that caught my attention, because you testified in the House committee hearing on energy efficiency, and you gave some type of a report. I listened to you, and I listened to you intently, and I got the gist of what you were trying to get at. I could not repeat it to save my life. and I know a lot of work went into it. I think the gist of what I understood you to say was that energy efficiency is cheaper to, in the long haul, to pursue than not. And as far as the state of New Hampshire, and that will help drive over the long haul the cost of energy, I believe. And how you got there was interesting. But you were talking about pennies or dollars, or $3.21 or 41 cents, as opposed to the cost of not having it. Could you kind of give us a layman's understanding of what energy efficiency and what are the benefits to our state are?
Sure. Well, we're always thinking about what that next unit of energy is going to cost. And so when you hear me talk about pennies, that's pennies per kilowatt hour, which is a relatively small unit of energy. That's the unit that you use and I use as individual consumers. And then when you're talking about dollars or tens of dollars or hundreds of dollars, then you're talking about megawatts and megawatt hours. That's a megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts. So that's what we're looking at when we're talking about industrial scale. How much can a big generator produce, that sort of thing. So if we stay in the pennies realm, we're always thinking about how many cents is it going to cost me to do that next little unit of work that I need my energy to do for me, right? Because the reason we have electricity and other forms of energy is because we need those things to do work for us, keep the lights on in the studio, or the heat on in your home, or the industrial process at your place of business moving. So when we're thinking about how to buy that next little unit of energy, it turns out that as a matter of physics and logic and economics, that if I do the same amount of work but use a little less energy, that's the same as buying a little more energy to use the next unit of work. So it's either a megawatt or a negawatt, if you want to look at it that way. So as I think about where am I going to get that next unit of energy that I need to power the lights in the studio, or keep the heat on in your house, or power the motor in your factory, it turns out that the cheapest thing I can do to get that next little bit of value out of the electric grid is actually to invest in making the devices that I'm using more energy efficient, so more work per unit of energy used. And it turns out that for that next kilowatt of energy that I save through energy efficiency, the utilities tell me, and I believe them, that it costs about 4 cents per kilowatt hour to do that. That happens to be cheaper than going out and buying the next kilowatt hour of energy from whoever happens to be offering it at the most cheap rate. And so as a consumer advocate, when I am out there thinking, where is the next place we go as consumers, my money is always going to be on energy efficiency because it is the cheapest resource that we have.
Where does New Hampshire rank with using energy efficiency as opposed to as a state, as opposed to, say, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, or Maine?
That's a terrific question. So as it happens, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, which is a nonprofit down in Washington, D.C. that keeps track of all this stuff, puts out a big scorecard every year that ranks the 51 states, including the District of Columbia, in terms of energy efficiency, and we happen to be ranked number 21 out of 51. So the top-ranked state happens to be the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, just a few miles from here, and I think Vermont is number 4 or 5. California is up there, Oregon. We're behind Maine and Rhode Island. Rhode Island is another highly ranked state. And there are different reasons why we're not in the top tier. But the good news from my standpoint is that we're far from the bottom. We're well above average as a state. And I think that we're going to get better because the 2017 rankings really take data from 2016. And in 2018, on January 1st, we're going to join the ranks of states with an energy efficiency resource standard. So that means that as a goal, we pursue all cost-effective energy efficiency, and the utilities have committed to, the electric utilities have committed to reducing their sales by, I think it's 3.1% over 3 years. So that puts us on an important pathway that I think will cause our ranking to go up. We're talking a year from now.
Now, you're with the consumer. You're basically with homes, but not necessarily with the industries or like BAE and other organizations.
Right. My job is to look after residential customers. Now, that isn't to say that I don't have a lot in common, or my constituency doesn't have a lot in common with commercial and industrial users of electricity, because we're all consumers. We have more in common than what separates us. Occasionally, there's sort of a pie that has to be divided up, the utility's revenue requirement, how much money does it need in order to provide its service. And occasionally we'll have squabbles with the other customer classes about how to divide that pie up so that I'm not subsidizing the commercial customers and vice versa. But for the most part, I think our interests are pretty well aligned with even the biggest industrial users of energy in the state.
Is there any low-hanging fruit with regard to what your average homeowner can do to take advantage of energy efficiency? Or is there something that should be done statewide as far as policy, or both, in order to improve our ranking and to help lower the energy demand?
Well, of course, everybody should, right after they finish watching us, run out to the Home Depot or to the hardware store or wherever and get rid of all the incandescent light bulbs in their house and replace them.
Is that a big chunk of it right there?
That's a big deal, yeah. And you asked what the low-hanging fruit is. Mm-hmm. Well, the energy savings that you get from switching away from incandescent and going straight to LED light bulbs is just fantastic. We had this interim step of compact fluorescent light bulbs, if you remember those.
Right.
Those were a lot more energy efficient than the incandescents, because if you remember, like, incandescent light bulbs just generate all this heat, right? I mean, everybody knows that they're light bulbs, so it's really hot. You didn't want to touch them. Well, that's wasted energy, right? Because we don't use lights for heat. We use them for light. So the LEDs produce very little heat in comparison to the amount of light that they produce.
Now, when you're talking LED...
light emitting diode is what that's
light emitting diodes. So, and actually, we just bought a house, and lo and behold, all the lights are. I was going to go change them. I didn't. I lifted the cover off, and they're all LED. Wonderful, perfect. This is great. But for the average person that doesn't know the difference between an LED and a fluorescent, are the fluorescents the ones that have that circular?
Generally, yeah. They're pretty well labeled at the store.
Okay.
And as long as we're talking about shopping, when you go to the store, you want to look for the light bulbs that have the Energy Star label on them. That is a brand that actually is owned by the Environmental Protection Administration. Mm-hmm. And that is a sign that a product has been very carefully vetted to make sure that it really does produce the best possible energy savings for the dollar that you invest.
Years ago, I even remember when I was a kid hearing about saving energy, and I remember them talking about turning on the dishwasher before you go to bed instead of during peak hours. Habits are things that we can, changing of habits, those are things that we can take into practice. Other than light bulbs, refrigerator seems to come to mind. If you can change your refrigerator from an old one to a new one.
Your furnace, that's a big deal. Weatherizing your home so that it is as insulated as it possibly can be. We leak a lot of heat out of our windows. And you just mentioned something interesting, this idea of changing your pattern of consumption to account for the peak. Now, that's a slightly different concept, right? Because you're still running your dishwasher, so you're not going to use less energy. You're going to use it at a different time of day. That's a really great thing to do. Unfortunately, right now here in New Hampshire, our electric rates don't vary by the time of day. So you don't get any financial reward if you take your dishwasher or your clothes dryer and run it in the overnight when electricity is relatively cheap at wholesale. So one of the things that we're talking about doing is having some pilot programs here in New Hampshire to let residential customers in particular experiment with time of use rates so that it becomes financially worth their while to say, you know what, we're gonna dry the clothes at 3 in the morning. We'll put a timer on our dryer. Mm-hmm. We'll turn the dryer on at 3 in the morning. We won't hear it. We'll be asleep, and we'll save some money.
I actually think we have a timer on our dryer. I think we do.
Right, so all we need to do is get you the time of use rate, and you're golden.
So I need to have a millennial figure it out for me, how to set it up.
Well, and eventually, you know, there are devices now where we could program your whole house to optimize your use of energy so that your comfort isn't compromised, but that you're still using energy at times of day when electricity is cheap, because the way the electric grid actually works in the overnight, electricity is so overabundant that actually there are hours when generators actually have to pay to generate, because they don't, the nuclear power plants, for example, they can't turn on and off very easily, so they're basically must run. And so in the overnight, they want to stay on, and they actually end up, the wholesale price becomes negative in some hours. They actually have to pay to generate.
And I think that's something that I think if people aren't aware of, this whole concept of, well, we have a peak demand, which is a real critical part of the conversation. Everybody says, well, we have plenty of energy out there, but it seems to be bottlenecked, and the prices go up because everybody's using it at the peak hours. And when there's a very cold snap that lasts for a long time, that demand for energy overloads our system, and it becomes very expensive, because then you have to fire up some of the gas turbines, and there are other things that have to be done to make up, to compensate for that peak demand. And so if we can alleviate some of that pressure on the peak demand, that can help overall. But again, it is a matter of changing habits.
Indeed, there's sort of the imperative of changing usage on a daily basis, so that you're doing your clothes drying and dishwashing in the overnight. And then there's this question of seasonal peak and changing demand, so that we address the problem of a really cold winter. The last one we had was in 2014. 2013 was a lot like this too. There are something like 30 hours a year when the people who run the electricity grid are really freaked out, because we are very reliant on natural gas as a generation fuel in New England, and lots of people in New England also use natural gas to heat their homes. So when the temperature is below zero in January, and the wind is howling, and every natural gas heating customer has her furnace turned up because it's cold, then the electric generators find that they sometimes have difficulty getting the fuel that they need, because they don't buy firm capacity on natural gas pipelines. They don't have a priority claim on the pipeline capacity. And so there are some situations where they may find themselves short on fuel. And we're having these fabulous arguments here in New Hampshire in particular on what to do about those 30 hours a year in a cold winter. And some people think this winter is going to be cold, but it could be mild like the last two. So
I haven't checked the almanac yet, so I'm not.
Or have I?
Never checked. So, in your opinion, are we becoming more and more dependent on natural gas?
That's a matter of fact. We are well over half of our generation capacity in New England is coming from natural gas. And so that's a problem, just like it would be a problem if we only produced corn for food. I mean, you might like corn, but monoculture is a problem in agriculture, and it's way better, I think, to diversify our sources of generation.
So here's where it's becoming a revelation to me a little bit, in that it seems to me that we tried to rectify that overdependence on oil. At one time, we had the exact same, well, I shouldn't say exact, but we had a very similar problem, where we had so much dependency on oil, and the prices of oil became exorbitant. So we, as the legislature, said, well, we need to diversify. And that's how we came up with the RPS programs and class 1s, class 2, class 3. It gets complicated, and I don't want to overcomplicate the conversation. But now that we've become less dependent on oil, we've become more dependent on gas. At least 40 to 43, 45% of our generation is gas. And that's just as unhealthy, in my humble opinion. Because we're back at the same old place where we're dependent on one major resource.
That's right, and you didn't mention coal.
I
That's
didn't
another
mention
fuel source that we're moving away from here in New England, and that has advantages and disadvantages. And you also haven't mentioned hydro. One of the major solutions that's on the table is becoming a lot more reliant on big hydroelectric generation facilities in Canada. But of course, as you know, we argue about the transmission lines that we need to build in order to bring massive new amounts of hydropower from Quebec and New Brunswick into New England.
I heard one of the senators today, and I didn't say this, but the other senator said, well, you know, we built a lot of roads and infrastructure down here in the southern part of New Hampshire to, you know, to help out what's going on up north. You think they would reciprocate and allow us to build an extra transmission line? Some people say, well, you know, that if we did go with Hydro-Quebec, the transmission line would only be an extension cord into Massachusetts, and New Hampshire wouldn't benefit from it. Now, it's an interesting concept, but I'm not so sure I agree with that.
Well, I think what people are talking about is the fact that Massachusetts has a big, much bigger than New Hampshire, mandatory procurement of renewable energy policy. And energy from Hydro-Quebec meets their mandatory procurement requirement, and they have issued requests for proposals that will result in the utilities in Massachusetts buying, the latest one I think is for 1,100 megawatts or something like that. And of course the Northern Pass project that Eversource is trying to build is an effort to meet that demand in Massachusetts. And so if they win, if they're successful in getting their proposal accepted, and if they manage to get their transmission line approved by the Site Evaluation Committee here, they'll build their transmission line, and essentially it will be a giant extension cord that'll provide electricity to Massachusetts. Now, we're one big regional electric grid here, and so when you take 1,100 megawatts of energy and you move it down from Canada and you deliver it into southern New Hampshire, you know, that will spread out as a matter of physics throughout the region, and we will all use it, but we in New Hampshire won't be buying it, nor will we be paying for it.
Correct. And well said, I should say. And I guess my perspective is well, they'll be building a transmission line. It will take demand off of the existing peak load from the existing, so that will reduce that load from those. New Hampshire won't pay for those transmission lines. It will feed into the grid, which some people don't, you know, we're not an island unto ourselves. In New Hampshire, we are part of a grid. And we can't just all of a sudden say, hey, we don't want to play this game anymore. We want to be an island to ourselves because we've got the nuclear power plant and blah, blah, blah. It just doesn't work that way. So it would be beneficial for the grid if that were to happen.
That's right, and one of the arguments that you hear Eversource make at the Site Evaluation Committee is, well, adding that amount of energy to the overall electricity grid in the region will have some price suppression effect on the wholesale price of electricity, which is an open market. And that's a valid point.
And it's a renewable type of energy. Correct? It's just
well, there
large.
are certainly those who don't think that Hydro-Quebec should count as renewable energy, and they talk about displacement of the native peoples in northern Quebec and that sort of thing. That's a little out of my pay grade, or at least beyond my expertise. But when you consider that those big hydro plants are already there, and you have Hydro-Quebec looking to sell their output, it is available to us here in New England.
Correct. I think, and what we tried to reclassify. There are certain classifications for RPS renewables, and making large hydro in New Hampshire a renewable source. It's as though everybody came out of the woodworks and they were outraged. And I was part of the problem, I believe, I guess, because I co-sponsored a bill. I had no idea of the ripple effect on how that would affect the local economy up north, and people that supply wood chips and low 65 kilowatts or something like that on low hydro.
Well, we produce a lot of electricity in New Hampshire using small dams that we've built and biomass plants that burn low-grade wood byproducts. And the folks who own and work at those plants, they jealously guard their little piece of the energy economy, and they correctly, I think, see imported hydro from Quebec as a threat to their little slice of the energy pie. And so you see those arguments play out in front of the hearings that you attend.
I don't think they mind it going through, but they don't want it to be to be part of the renewables here in New Hampshire.
Right.
Because actually, the legislator gave them the incentive years ago to invest all their capital to create renewables so that there would be alternative energies in New Hampshire, so we weren't so dependent on oil. So we created this industry, and they're basically hanging on by a thread, even though they're subsidized to some degree. But we had an interesting conversation about the benefits and how that if you don't have the wood chip places or burning facilities, then you have to bury the rest of the wood that's being milled or ship it out, and there's a high cost to that. And they actually can convert it into fertilizer, and it just has such a ripple effect that
Yeah, there are really no easy answers to any of this.
no. But that's why I wanted you on the show. We'll have other people on the show as well to talk about their perspective. But getting back to energy efficiency, is there a policy within a minute and 57 seconds that is before the legislature that you would think would be beneficial to consider?
Well, right now the legislature is still thinking about a bill that would forbid the Public Utilities Commission from raising the system benefits charge without the legislature's permission. The system benefits charge is the charge on your electric bill where you pay that 4 cents that I was talking about, that is still, I think, cheaper than the 5 cents you'd have to pay elsewhere on your bill to acquire that next kilowatt of energy. We have a really excellent plan that we're working through with the utilities to implement the energy efficiency resource standard starting in January. And if the legislature were to pop up in January and pass a bill that says, well, wait a minute, the only way you can do that is if we approve it legislatively, then that would have the effect of kind of interrupting the whole process, and it would undermine what we're trying to accomplish. So I guess my best advice to my friends in the legislature is let us do our thing for the next year or 2 or 3, and let us come and explain it to you so that you feel comfortable with what we're doing, but trust us a little bit. And if your ideology is such that you see this as an inappropriate intervention in the economy, you have a point. It's the opposite of free market, but it's an example of where the perfect should not become the enemy of the good.
Wonderful. And if people want to learn more about it, where can they go to either find more information that you provide or as a consumer advocate?
They can. The first place to look, I think, is on the website of the PUC, puc.nh.gov.
Don, thanks for coming on the show.
This has been a great pleasure.
We appreciate it. Thank you for watching the show. Hopefully this has been beneficial, and if you have any questions, check out the PUC website. Until next week, thanks for watching. That's a wrap.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.